Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mrs. Cook, President Cook, for being here. Well, the U.S. Health Agency database reporting adverse effects on COVID vaccines, the VIRS, showed the batch codes of vials whose administration was reported as being correlated to adverse effects and or deaths of vaccinated people. My question is, why did the EMA request VIRS to delete the vials batch codes from its reports, jointly with other specifications, and never did EMA include batch codes of vaccines whose adverse effects were reported and published on its database? When that information, the batch code, would not be able to allow the identification of affected individuals, and thus its publication would not be non-compliant with GDPR regulation. I precise that because in your written reply to my question on this issue, you claimed that the deletion of this data was necessary to comply with the GDPR regulation. Well, I think that the batch codes are not enough to identify the person who reports the effects. My second question is, how do you distinguish long COVID symptoms by adverse effects in vaccinated people? What criteria do you use to establish correlation and causation between previous COVID infection and the so-called long COVID symptoms? And I pray you not to dismiss this issue as your colleague, as Commissioner Kyriakides did very few minutes ago, because it would be unfair. And my very last question is, on which data and by what scientific method of evaluation does EMA nowadays calculate the benefit-risk ratio of each COVID vaccine? And how do you consider in this evaluation the adverse effects reports collected by VIRS and EMA? Thank you very much.
Question from Madam Donato on the data that was provided to the VAERS. So that's the US vaccine database. We have EudraVigilance in the EU, and in the US they use a database which is called VAERS. We have guided by the data protection laws in Europe, we have a EudraVigilance access policy that limits the amount of data that we can provide to countries outside the EU that do not have the equivalent personal data protection as we do. And in fact, we found because the combination of that these were rare side effects coming from countries with small populations meant that it was theoretically possible to identify the individual. So we asked that this data be removed from the database, and that was in consultation with the European Data Protection Supervisor. And so we have been doing this to make sure that there was compliance with the Data Protection Supervisor legislation. Then to come to the question on the benefit risk of a vaccine, this is we give guidance on the type of information we would expect to allow us to come to a benefit risk judgment. But in fact, it is an expert judgment, and it's based on the severity of the disease, the effectiveness of the medicine or vaccine, the safety profile, and it is there is not a hard and fast, it is an expert evaluation that is, again, I would say, taken very, very seriously by our committee for human medicinal products made up of experts from all the member states. And in this case, we also had the input from our emergency task force, where we had infectious disease experts contributing to this decision. And that's pretty much the standard process, that we look at the data, we look very critically at the data, and once our expert committee come to a decision that the benefit risk is positive, they will also ask for additional studies to make sure. We have the safety monitoring that we put in place to make sure that in the event that there was anything that would come up that would change that, we have a methodology to allow us to do that.